Hi, everyone. Thank you so
Hello.
much for joining us for this last Musas webinar. I'm so excited to be here. I am Ismée Williams. I am the author of This Train is Being Held, and I'm super excited today because I get to interview one of my favorite authors and friends, I.W. Gregorio, otherwise known as Ilene, who has just published her second fabulous young adult novel called This Is My Brain in Love. And I was so lucky because I got to read an early copy before it even hit the shelves. And I was just blown away by the story, by the themes, the importance of this book. And I thought to myself, this book is so important and it's going to make such a big splash. And it's going to touch so many lives. So thank you so much, Ilene, for joining us
Thank you for having
for this
me.
webinar. So guys, I'm going to, as you join, we love it if you would just pop onto the chat and let us know where you're joining from and introduce yourselves. I will activate some polls just to get us rolling. Just curious to see who our viewers are. So if you are a writer, tell us if you're pre-published or otherwise, or if you're not a writer, just curious. Let's see there, I published it.
Great.
And it seems like Ilene is joining in from, another Ilene from Hudson Valley. Hi, Sheila from Charlotte. This is so great.
Yeah.
And let's see, I can do some other polls too. So as people are coming in and joining us, Ilene, I'm going to start with my first question. But so I have a script of questions, but we also love to include the audience. So if you think of something and you would like to ask, please go right ahead and put it into the chat and we will call on you. Okay, so first of all, I love talking with authors about, where their ideas came from. So tell me, Ilene, how did you come up with the idea? What was your inspiration for This Is My Brain in Love? And actually, maybe you should just introduce the book, like tell people what the book is sort of about.
Yes. So This Is My Brain in Love is what my publishers have been pitching as a mostly happy book about mental illness. And when I set about doing that, there are two main inspirations. One was that thematically, I wanted to write a book about anxiety and depression where there's not an active suicide attempt. Because I really do feel that all the media representation on mental health is really very heavily weighted towards death by suicide, which is obviously like the most dramatic element, which is really final. So of course it's something that people are going to write about and make movies about. But I feel like a lot of this book is inspired by my own experiences growing up with sort of undiagnosed anxiety and depression in an immigrant family. Like there's so much that needs to happen to prevent everything later on. That I never really read a book growing up that was about that process and like understanding the vocabulary you need to have and understanding that there are options and figuring out how to wade through all those options. And so I really wanted to write that book because it was a book that I think I needed as a teenager, and that many people so far have said that they wish that they had as a teenager. So there's that inspiration about the theme, which I've really felt really strongly about. But the most proximal inspiration for the actual plot, the story, actually has to do with a little hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant that is near my house. So a little background about me. So I grew up in a very conservative part of upstate New York, like central New York, really. Like if you watch Orange is the New Black, you know about Pennsyltucky, right? The character. And so I grew up in New York Tucky. There's like basically New York City, Buffalo, and then Alabama in between. And I grew up in the Alabama part where I was one of 3 kids of color in my high school. And so I felt very isolated, and like the only places near, like there, I grew up always feeling like an other. Interestingly, when I grew up, I went to school, in more urban areas, but I ended up living in a area similar to what I grew up in, where I'm very much the minority. But I found this wonderful little hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant that had very authentic dumplings and like scallion pancakes and the amazing stir-fried green beans, like all the food that I crave as comfort food when I'm really hungry, when I don't have time to cook. And I remember going into that restaurant one day, and normally it was, owned and run by this Chinese family. But that day I went in and there was this tall, really awkward looking white boy trying to make sushi. Like, if you could think of the most physically challenged sushi making process ever. And I was like, there has to be a story behind it. This is the way a YA author thinks. That guy must have a crush on the owner's daughter. And so that was the proximal, I like inspiration for the story of, this meet cute where, the boy has a crush on the daughter, but the girl's father won't let him date without him doing these things. And so that sort of ended up being the focus for this idea that, like, Will, one of my main characters, has to, like, as a group, they have to finish 3 quests. It's like that quest to win the hands of a princess's marriage. And interestingly enough, also that restaurant 2 years later did close. And I mean, it hurt me so deeply, because to me, it was such a link to my heritage, to everything. And so that was sort of the inspiration for the whole thing.
Oh, that's so amazing. And just tell me, did you, was this part of like a 2-book contract, or did you just come with like a fresh idea and your agent and publisher were like, yes, we want that? Like, how did that work out for you?
This was very, so I didn't have a 2-book contract. And so for the audience, I don't know whether they know about my background, but like Ismée, I'm a physician as well. And I'm still in full-time practice. And so, writing is definitely my avocation. But, I have a limited amount of time to do it. And so I kind of knew early on that I couldn't do a 2-book deal. And so I sold none of the above, and it was 1 book. But I did have an option. And so I initially, because I was so busy and I knew it would take a while for me to write a full book with a secondary job, my agent suggested I write a proposal. And so I did write a proposal, and I finished it over a weekend retreat, literally the week before the 2016 election. So,
was this a retreat just for writing?
Was a retreat just for writing.
Nice.
And interestingly enough, my editor for the first book didn't really connect to it quite as much. And I think the reason is because at that point, one of the characters, my book is told in 2 points of view, and one of the characters is me. The other character is is a mixed race Nigerian boy. And so that's a very different point of view than when I lived in, and I think I hadn't quite gotten the voice yet. And so when she passed on the proposal, I was like, oh, I'm never going to sell another book. But then we went out wide, and it sold within a few weeks. So I feel really grateful that someone saw the potential at an early stage, because selling one proposal is very different than selling a full book, because you really have to, it's like buying a house without any furniture in it. Like, you can't see,
or buying a house where it's not been completely built yet. Like, you don't even have all of the plans made. You can look at the land and be like, oh, I can envision a house here. So was your proposal just like a page, or it sounds like it was more in depth?
No, it was like 30 pages of actual writing. So I had to write the dual points of view and an outline. And
then you sold the book just based on that when you went wide.
Yeah, that's awesome. Based on that.
That's so interesting. I learned, because you know what, that's the thing. When you're not in the field, you imagine like that there's like a standard rule that this is the way to do it, right? And I remember being a medical student and imagining like, oh, well, if a patient has this, you would do that. And then you become a physician and you realize actually there's multiple permutations.
Yeah, there are a lot of different. And
it's the same in writing too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, what happened with me, I also didn't have a 2-book deal. I would have loved to get one, but I didn't. But they did want an option of first refusal. And my first book did well enough that they said, the team said, we're really interested. What other ideas do you have? And I gave them, I was telling Ilene this the other day, I had written a fantasy manuscript, which I loved. I love to read fantasy. And so I'd written one and I gave it to them and they said, we like it, but it's not distinct enough from some other titles that we have coming down the road. Can you write something that's more similar to what your first book? And they said, just give us some ideas. And I literally wrote, I think, 3 sentences. I wrote multiple ideas, like on one page, like maybe 4 ideas. And they looked at it and they said, that one, write that one. And then we sold it. I signed a contract. And then I was like, oh my God, but now I have to write it. Like I hadn't really fleshed it all out or anything. So it was a very, very different experience.
Writing when you writing when you're on deadline and when you're on proposal is really frightening because, I mean, for me, I had to write a book in 6 months. It's the fastest I've ever written an entire book. And I was still working full time. You know, I still have 2 kids. And it was, the worst thing about it is worrying that you haven't had enough time and that the book isn't going to be what you want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
But the great thing about writing on proposal is that it was a kick in the pants. You know, like you knew, there was a certainty.
It makes you go.
There was no time to be like, oh, is this the right story? Is it ever going to sell? You know, and I'm a good person on deadline. It's a great time for you to be able to get rid of your internal editor. A lot of writers, you know, spend hours agonizing over sentences, and like when you're on a deadline, you don't.
That's me. I'll be like, this word or that word.
Yeah,
this
you don't
have
have
that word.
So that I just put a star in there when I don't know the right word, and I forge on. And sometimes looking back, you either realize that section isn't necessary, or the perspective that the rest of the story gives you is what you need to find that word.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's true. Sometimes you need to finish it to then step back and look at the whole forest before you can go back in and prune some trees. At least I found that to be the case. So you mentioned pants, kick in the pants. So and we talked about writing on proposal. So for this book, were you a pantser or a plotter? And was that the same approach that you took for your first book?
For this book, I definitely had to be a plotter because I was required to have an outline, which I didn't necessarily stick to entirely. I mean, but the broad outlines were there. And it was really, I loved plotting it out beforehand. I'm actually going to do that for my next book because just the ability to have those beats, they're like anchors. And if you are stuck in one area, you can just go to another anchor and like write that if you kind of know where it's going to go. And it might not go there perfectly. And certainly things do change. You know, there were definitely a lot as I was writing deeper and deeper into the book, like maybe halfway, like I realized I had to veer off. But still the spirit, like having an outline allows you to see the broad strokes and give you the spirit that you want to create in the book. And so it was really helpful. It was really wonderful.
And so for those who might not know, so a plotter is somebody who sort of plots out where the story is going from beginning to end and sort of hashes out a lot of at least the broad strokes. There's different types of plotting. And I've heard a pantser is somebody who just sort of starts with an idea and some characters and just starts writing and sees what happens. And that's sort of what I did with my very first manuscript, which definitely did not get published, by the way. But we do have a question from Ilene, who's watching. So Ilene, who's in the webinar, what was the writing retreat that you attended?
Sure. So the one writing retreat where I actually got it done was a residency at a hotel in Miami. It's called the Betsy Hotel, and they had
sounds awesome.
They had a writing for young adults thing where you can you can have all expenses paid like in the hotel, like room and board for a week, and you just had to like do a couple events, and it was amazing because they had this cute little room full of books, well lit, and you could also go up to the rooftop lounge and like being able to get room service, you know, like if you're like to just have your needs catered to was amazing. It was the best thing that I've ever done for my writing career. But that not everyone can have access to that. Another retreat where I actually did a revision on the proposal before I sent it off was it's called Madcap Retreats. Natalie Parker runs it, and Natalie is an author as well. Her most recent book, I think, is Sea Fire. It's about a pirate, and she's a really wonderful writer, and so weird. Okay, she's a really wonderful writer, and she is into creating community. And so they started off just as general retreats, but the retreat that I went to was actually a retreat about writing outside your experience and how to write responsibly. And it was co-sponsored with We Need Diverse Books. And so it was amazing combination of both time to write with daily seminars by experts like Donielle Clayton on what you need to consider when you're writing outside your experience, like how to write responsibly.
I want to hear some more of that.
Yeah.
That's
incredible.
not on my list, but let's go off script now. Tell us, share with us some of like the little pearls of wisdom that you got from that, because I think that's
absolutely.
You know, I feel like we hear about so many. You know, I did a webinar with Myra Cuevas about how to diversify your library, and I was lucky enough to do a lecture for the New Jersey SCBWI on how to just about diversity in general. And so it's a big issue because we all want to be making sure that our books reflect sort of the beauty of the variation of the human experience, and yet we don't want to get it wrong, right?
Exactly.
I mean, so
one way to go into it, so one person had a question about whether this is my first book, and it's not. So this is my first book, None of the Above.
I love that book too.
Which was pitched as Middlesex meets Mean Girls. And because I'm a doctor in real life, I'm a urologist. So I work on kidneys and bladders and urinary systems. And it was inspired by a patient I treated during residency who found out when she was 17 that she was born intersex, neither male nor female. The older term for intersex is a hermaphrodite, but that's not a term it's considered a slur by many. And so intersex is a more scientific and factual term. That was sort of the book that put me on the map, but I've always felt a little uncomfortable because I'm not intersex myself. And so I had to do a lot of research and make sure that I was being responsible, because intersex states carry with it a lot of stigma and shame that has plagued the intersex community for a long time. And so I needed to make sure I got it right, because if you can literally count on your hand the number of representations that a population has, like you can think of Jeffrey Eugenides Middlesex, which is problematic because of a lot of its terminology. There's another book called Golden Boy, which is a British book that's also a little bit problematic because there was sexual violence against the intersex person, and I was like, I don't know if that's what I want to, how I don't want to necessarily portray intersex people as victims per se. And so in doing this, I had to do obviously tons of research, not only reading books about it, but also talking to people. And more importantly, after I've actually written the book, the most important thing was having intersex people read it, the so-called sensitivity reader or content reader, who can see things, that you would never be able to see because you're not part of that population. And so I had dozens of intersex men and women read that book, and they were offering me suggestions up through second pass pages, which is literally the threshold before it goes to press. So it wasn't just in the development stage, it was after, like, I had something that was ready to go to the public, and I'd still made word changes based on their advice, because again, they saw problematic areas that I never would have considered.
Yeah, there's a lot about the sort of the unconscious bias that you have as a person, even if you're trying to do your best and be a good person. And it's very typically used with racism, like that white people have the unconscious bias. They just they don't understand how a person of color might be perceiving a certain situation because they're not in their shoes. And so it is really important.
The important thing is, if you go into writing a book that is not an Own Voices book, you just have to go in with humility, knowing that even despite all your best efforts, you might get it wrong. And I think
it's also important to remember that it's not always dichotomous, right or wrong. I mean, there's a lot of gray, and what might represent, because every single intersex person is also unique. So maybe some intersex individuals will think this is exactly my story, and others will read it and say, that's not me at all. This doesn't represent me at all. And that's okay also.
Yeah, there's no single story, which is why it's so important to have multiple views, multiple experiences, to read widely, and to make it so that these tropes that often appear in writing about certain populations don't become the dominant ones, So,
Yeah.
I mean, Donielle Clayton often talks about how, when she was growing up, she got sick of reading stories where there were Black characters and it was all about the Civil War or slavery. And so, people like Renee Watson will write, about Black kids living in suburbia, and in This Is My Great Love, I very specifically wanted to have the love interest will be not white. And I also wanted to invert the model minority myths associated with Asian culture. And it was very important for me that it be the Black boy or the Black appearing boy, he's mixed race, be the one who has straight A's, whose mom was a doctor, because.
And who's well off.
Who's well off.
Yeah, it's really important. We've got some great comments. I just want to read some out loud. So Kathleen says teens love reading a book that they can relate to so they don't feel alone. I think that's really important, especially getting back to the mental health issue, which I do want to get back to. I just want to read some of these other great comments. Keep them coming. Eileen loves that she did research to be responsible, which is important. And then we have a question from Sheila, who's asking about resources that you might have used besides the Story Genius for plotting and character development. So what say you?
I'm not familiar with Story Genius. Is that
It's a book.
Website? It's a book. Oh yeah, Story Genius is good. My favorite story plotting book is Save the Cat, which is actually technically a book about screenwriting, but is a really great story, a really great book to give you a framework to think about the arcs that pretty much almost all book or movie have, in terms of how to create a sympathetic character, like when in a story makes sense for certain beats, meaning beats of action, rising, plot, and fall. I read that before I ever wrote a fiction book, and it's been sort of the basis for how I conceptualize story forever. So that's really great. In terms of actual writing tools, I don't know if anyone uses Scrivener, which is I hate Scrivener for actually creating the Word document, but it's so great in the plotting stages because it acts as a virtual corkboard where you can actually, because Save the Cat is very much based on the idea that there are 24, plot elements, or 12, I forget how many, 14. And if you have a card for each of them, you can start working on bit and chunks of books and moving them around if you need to, especially if you were writing books.
You can color code them by theme or protagonist or any of those things. And it's also really helpful for people like me who don't have a space for like a very large whiteboard, or I'm so jealous of, I think it was Gillian Flynn who did this great interview of how she plotted out Gone Girl with like two enormous whiteboards with Post-its in her basement. I was like, I don't have that room. I live in New York City all the time. Yeah. But so with Scrivener, you can sort of do that. So are there any other crafting books that you recommend?
Oh, I hear it.
As we have one of the great questions from the audience.
I don't know if you guys know Cheryl Klein, who used to be an editor at Arthur Levine. So she has an amazing book, The Magic Words. I heard her speak at SCBWI New Jersey, before I sold my first book. And her way of breaking down character and the importance of understanding your character's want and their need was mind-blowing. So this is not for everybody, because not everyone, this is a very detail-oriented, these are assignments that you have to create, to create your thing. It's a very labor-intensive way to do it.
So it's like a workbook?
It's no, it's a guidebook. For instance, the chapters are principles of good writing, how to write a novel, and then talking about plot, obstacles, movement, momentum, personality. So most of it's about crafting. Most of it's so Cheryl Klein was one of the continuity editors for the Harry Potter. And so she is someone who really believes in plot and motivation and how your character's motivations affect the plot. And she's someone who drills so deeply down into the mechanics of writing and how scenes work. It's absolutely brilliant because she's really good at including clips or samples from some of her authors' books
Mhm.
as examples of what's effective. She talks about how she's had her writers like write in completely shift their point of view.
Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of a wonky book, but it's I would definitely recommend reading it.
I have one of her books, and I also heard her speak at the New York Winter Conference at CBWI, and she was the one who coined the phrase "kill your babies" or "kill your darlings" in terms of in the editing process. Like sometimes, like you might have this fabulous scene, and it's so well written, but if it doesn't serve the purpose of the plot or the character arcs, then you gotta go. You gotta kill it.
Yeah.
So that's great. I want to look up that book, that other book from her. Okay, so let's move on to some more themes. We touched on it a little bit in the beginning when you talked about the inspiration. But what were some of the themes that you really wanted to draw out or have people discuss or have people think about, take away with them after reading This Is My Brain in Love?
So I think I wrote one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book was for my kids, because I wanted them to understand that sometimes brains are unreliable, that they insert thoughts into your consciousness that are invasive and unhelpful. And so when I wrote this book, I felt very, very strongly that it be written in dual narrative. And that was, challenging because it's hard to make distinctive voices, especially when you aren't part of one of them. Like, again, it required a lot of research. But I felt like it needed to be in dual narrative because I needed to be able to show the same incident through two different perspectives and show that the same incident could be, and in this case, it was they're selling dumplings. They can be viewed by one as an amazing success and the other one as a total failure.
That's a great scene.
And, that also happens with romance too, right? That happens because people's mental illnesses and issues play out in relationships all the time. Like if an anxious person is dating someone, they can sometimes psych them out of the relationship by saying, oh, by convincing themselves that the person doesn't actually love them or like them. Whereas a depressed person, by drawing into themselves, can do a similar type of thing where they say that they're not lovable. And it was really important for me to be able to show those instances and also show how they're destructive and how people can start talking themselves back into it. And so it was important for me to have a therapy session in it and to have, a frank discussion of what medications, what role medications might play.
And I loved that both of the characters had their own unique struggles and how they were able to learn from one another and improve themselves about it. So not to spoil it too much, but you guys have to read it. It's very, really good. And I think I'm gonna share a file. So my book has a little touches on mental illness, but from the point of view of the sibling. So someone who is in a family where the mother and the siblings' mental illness really drives almost all of the family dynamic, which is, a very different perspective, but also one that I think is useful to talk about. And so Ilene was kind enough. I'm going to share this now. So there's a file that is if you look under files, we're sharing it if anybody is interested in downloading some information about mental health resources. Because the number of, the data is showing that the number of young people who are affected by mental illness, now whether that's themselves affected or touched by somebody who's close to them or in their family, it's like ridiculously large number. And, we're reading now in the news constantly about how kids these days are just so anxious. They're so much more anxious than our generation was. And so it's really important to feel that that you can talk about these things to try and that's one of the other aspects that I loved about your book, that it really addresses the stigma of it, sort of that it just acknowledges it, that you know, a lot of people feel that it's not okay to talk about this, or they feel ashamed, even though, you know, if you got strep throat, you wouldn't feel ashamed, you know, like you would go to the doctor and get help. But so it's really important for all of us, and especially if you're an educator or a librarian out there, these are important books, I think, to be passing around. So, okay. So let's get some fun things. So what was the hardest scene to write and why?
I think the hardest scene to write was actually the meet cute. So the scene where they meet in the beginning, because I did not want to fall into the trap of insta love, which is something that's always bothered me, you know, in a lot of romance books in general, let alone YA books. You know, I mean, that whole saw them across the crowded room and it was fate, and, you know, everything, you know, flowed perfectly from there. I mean, so I needed to find the right balance of attraction, but like not go overboard. Like, you know, I didn't want to be an Edward Cullen moment where like the protagonist was, or Jocelyn just like, oh, he's so hot and rich. You know, I wanted to be real. You know, I wanted them to connect over small things, and I wanted them to start off as friends first.
Well, you did it very well. So that was very well done. Did you have to rewrite it a bunch of times? Or?
I did. I had to condense it because it's interesting. One of the editorial comments I had in the beginning was that we needed to get to their really connecting faster. Because in this book, it's kind of like, it's not one of those standard romance novels where like you start at the beginning and then like, you know, they hate at first sight, and then they eventually get together. It's more like they like each other and then they get together, but then they're forced apart by Justin's parents, and then they have to get back together. And so we need to reach that first point where they got together earlier. And like, again, for me, it was like struggling to like not make it go too fast, but also making it fast enough that the reader would stay interested.
Right. The critical pacing issue. Okay, so what was one of those anchors that you looked forward to writing? Tell us about a really easy scene.
I love writing about food. And
awesome.
So all the restaurant scenes I really loved, because so for me growing up in upstate New York, I didn't have a lot of connections to my culture because, you know, actually, even though I'm of Chinese descent, my family is a couple generations removed from China. My father and my grandfather were actually born in South Africa. My mother was born in Taiwan, but like I didn't live with her. And so like my family is like a really good depiction of how widespread the Asian diaspora is. And I mean, because my family has lived in more, members of my family have, even though we're all of Chinese descent, have lived in South Africa, in Malaysia, in an island called Mauritius, which is a tiny island off the coast of Madagascar, and then also in Taiwan and Singapore. So food is complicated for me because when I was young, it was initially something that made me felt othered and set apart from others. I never brought Chinese food to school for lunch. And I remember that when I had friends over, my grandmother would always, instead of doing like oxtail soup or something amazing like that, she would do tuna casserole.
Interesting. So even she was aware of it.
She was aware of it too. But at the same time, you know, when I was visiting my mother, I mean, food was such an essential part of my trips to Taiwan, you know, like the scallion pancakes, like cooked right in front of you, or you could like see how much oil they poured into it. Like the weird desserts, like tofu pudding and things like that. And then when it started going to dim sum restaurants for the first time in, I guess, late high school, or early college, they all represented. Hello? They all represented me embracing and be feeling more part of my culture, not being ashamed of anymore, but reveling in how amazing it is and wanting to introduce it to other people.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's so I had a little bit. So when I read your book, before I'd read it, when I saw the sort of the the plot synopsis I reached on. I was like, our books have a lot of similar themes. So my book also deals with sort of immigrant. They're both Latinos. They fall in love, but they're very different. There's a big class difference, and one is white and one is not white. And I drew off of my own experience being the daughter of a Cuban immigrant. My Cuban grandparents, my abuelos lived with us, and my grandmother, my Cuban grandmother, I used to joke because my mom is a doctor, and so she left us when we were really young to go to medical school when I was in first grade. And I joke that my mom had a stay-at-home wife, which was my grandmother. So my grandmother did all the cooking, all the cleaning, drove us everywhere, and it was fabulous. And she was like well known throughout all of my friends' parents for her cooking. So she cooked so much. It was rice and beans, flan, pica. They would put in their orders for like what they wanted from her all the time. And I had a similar upbringing in that I was in a small town in Connecticut that was not very diverse, but I don't look diverse. And my father is white, so I don't look diverse. So people only knew that I had a Cuban grandparent, or that I had any Cuban in my family if they came to my house and they met my grandmother, who spoke English but with such a thick accent. You had to know her for a few months before you could actually understand her. Yeah, I like food was a very large part of my like Cuban identity. I mean, even now I cook all that food. So
yeah,
and I put some of that in the book too.
Food is love. I definitely love the scenes where he has to bring it to his stepmother. From his mom. Yeah. And they're the people want on the train who like try to get it from him. Like it's so it was a really great scene.
Give us some. Yeah, those are things that we make every year for Christmas, and we've been giving them out as teachers' gifts because they're actually very easy to make, and they're very like tropical tasting. Like I love guava. But anyway, all right.
Oh, yummy.
Enough with the food talk because
food talk
really hungry.
Okay, yeah, food talk is really good, but I think it's such a great way to bridge cultures, and also a fun fact is that the original title, my working title for the book, was The Noodle Connection.
Oh, that's so cute.
Because my husband always talks about how because he's Italian and I'm Chinese, and so he also says, well, with Italians and Chinese, there's a noodle connection. Spaghetti is the same thing as lo mein, right? And so he talks about the noodle connection. But the interesting thing is that Nigeria is actually one of the world's biggest consumption of ramen noodles. I don't know if you knew that. It's huge there. It's something called Indomie, which is an Indonesian version of it that they make all the time, like fried noodle mix. And so right, and there's the scene where his mother makes him the special food for his birthday, right?
Yeah. Yeah, food is love. It definitely is. Okay, so what is your writing Achilles heel besides meet cutes?
My writing Achilles heel.
Like, is there something that you just find it's very easy to like develop plot, but maybe characters harder, or you develop character and then like you don't have enough action going on? Or
I think plot is hard, and I think that one thing I did for my very first book that never got published is that I made the stakes too predictable, and that's something that's really hard. I mean, it's hard in general. It's hard because when you do grow up with these very when you grew up watching movies with the very staged plot lines, like in Save the Cat, it's easy to sort of like I can't remember the last time I didn't watch a movie and say, okay, they're going to do this next, and it happens.
I know,
right?
I know.
And
my family hates when I do that.
Exactly, yeah. And so in this one, I had to change things around a bit. I had to make decisions to make it not as easy for my characters. It's I think that for none of the above, I got a couple, I think that also the Achilles heel is that when you are talking about really weighty issues, it can be hard for people who are readers not to think that you solve those issues too easily in the end. And so I got a couple of comments saying that, oh, the adversary in that first book was overcome too easily, or something like that. And I'm like, you're kind of right. But at the same time, that book especially really needed to have a happy ending, because intersex kids need to know that there's hope and that they can find love. And, for a long time, I think that books with LGBT characters, were usually books about homophobia and transphobia and violence. And you needed to, intersex and trans and gay kids need to know that they're worthy of love.
Yeah, and that there's also not one single story for them either. They can have lots of other stories. So we do have a question, which is on my question sheet as well. Would you like to share what you're working on next?
Sure. Okay. So I'm working on something completely different. And this is the book that I started while my proposal was out on sub, and I couldn't fathom the thought of writing another book almost. And so I just wanted to write something completely for myself. And so I grew up, as I said, in upstate New York, and, very much an outsider, and books were always my friends. And I was a total fantasy nerd. I mean, I am such a fantasy nerd, which is ironic because now the only thing I read is contemporary. I've always wanted to write a fantasy book, but initially I thought it would be too hard. I thought that the world building would be too time consuming. I didn't know if I could do it well enough. And so in writing this, it's interesting. When you write about people other than yourself, the world building in this was just as labor intensive, research intensive as I think world building for fantasy can be, because there are so many things I really had to get right, so many details I had to learn. And so now I feel like I'm ready to finally tackle that fantasy. And so I have an idea in the beginning of a proposal for a YA historical fantasy medical thriller.
Ooh.
That kind of combines my medical background, my love of conspiracy theories, and also my love for fantasy. And I'm really excited about eventually being able to work on that once I'm not having to do so much, non-writing stuff, as Ismée knows.
Right.
There's
a lot of that.
There's so much non-writing stuff like social media and promotion, and blog post writing and essay writing, and at a certain point, I'm just going to have to let that go and start on the new thing. And I'm really looking.
That sounds really exciting. Yeah. So you mentioned about the research. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about how you build the worlds for your books? Do you use Scrivener? Do you have some sort of other structure that you use, or?
I definitely do use Scrivener, and there's a question there by Candace about pacing, and Scrivener is great for being able to show the pacing. If you have 5 note cards, and the note cards can be associated with a text, and so you can say, okay, this note card is representing this many pages of text and that, so it's a really great way to see when you're relying too heavily on one thing. And pacing, luckily, is something that editors are really good at. Because they are looking at it from a completely different perspective, completely fresh perspective. They're not as close to it, and so I do, listen to my editors when they say it's sagging or when pacing isn't an issue, and I just tighten it up. But going back, you were talking about
world building.
So world building.
Right. So I
use Scrivener for world building, and world building is okay, great. Just flicker for a second.
Yeah, so occasionally it freezes, but we can still hear your voice. I don't know.
Good. So world building is a process that does take time and researching and interviewing from me. I mean, like I said, I interviewed.
You interview, so for the first one, you interview actual people.
I interviewed intersex people, talk to them about the formative moments that they had in their life, the things that they remember, the interactions with doctors that they had. And for this book, I did interview a lot of people of Nigerian descent. I talked to them about the conversations they had with their families, the vocabulary that they use surrounding mental illness. and also like what their family structure is like, how they deal with problems.
Was it hard to find people willing to talk to you? Like, how did you find these people?
It was at first. It was the holy grail. The thing that was really hard to find was to find a mixed race Nigerian boy, and it took me like because there actually are not that many mixed race Nigerian couples out there, because there still is a very, very strong sense within the Nigerian community that they want to be with people in their community, and so it was interesting talking to that couple about the challenges and barriers they had to overcome on both sides, from both families. And so that was something that really informed the book. But I had to reach out to friends of friends. Like I crowdsourced on Facebook. Eric Smith, the Asian author, connected me with one of his authors, Basi Ikpe, who's Nigerian, wonderful Nigerian memoir writer, whose book just came out. And then, so a lot of interviews, and again, lots of people reading the book afterwards. And world building, you have to focus on every aspect. So I actually went into people's homes, to see, what type of house it was, what the central focus of the house was, what kind of things they had on the walls. World building focuses, like, you have to know those details. You need to know the ingredients that people use in their cooking. You need to, understand the details that give depth.
Yeah, and make the story unique, and not stereotypical or falling into a trope at all. I mean, that's what good writing is all about, really. Mm-hmm. But so for world building for fantasy, you're not going to be able to interview live people for historical fantasy, right?
No, but I have been researching. So I do want it to be set in sort of steampunk, a steampunk area, steampunk era of China. And so I've been doing a lot of research on the Opium Wars period, and on the really like the sort of the basis of a lot of this xenophobia and of the tension between China and outsiders. It's really fascinating to read. It's so incredible, the things that have been perpetrated by Chinese governments and on them. Destruction of cultural areas in China, the use of narcotics essentially as a way to
weaponize.
I mean, it's really neat stuff. And the pictures that you see, the pictures of the archives. And I did go to Taiwan this past summer. Gosh, was it only this past summer? It seems so long.
Yeah, time is warping. Oh no, we lost Ilene. Or maybe she can dial back in. Hi guys, I'm still here. The things I wanted to talk about with her were also, I like this question about is it difficult to write during the quarantine? So I can answer that for myself. I've found it very difficult to write during this lockdown period. So I mentioned I'm actually a physician and I live and work in New York City, but what I do is very subspecialized. I do fetal echocardiography. And so I do ultrasounds and interpret ultrasounds of pregnant women's fetuses' hearts. And so when this all started happening, I remember on Monday and Tuesday, so it was Friday the 13th of March, which was when we left the city and we came out to Connecticut, where I grew up. And Monday and Tuesday, I saw patients. And then by that weekend, we decided we'd canceled all further fetal echoes that we were going to be doing, unless it was for the high-risk patients. A lot of what I do is screening. So we're just screening to make sure it's okay, that if somebody has a high risk, they might have a problem. But a lot of those got canceled as we prepared for the crush. So I've been lucky. I haven't been called to the front lines because of what I do, but I've been extremely distracted because so many of my colleagues and so many of my friends are working in New York City. And I spent the first month on basically like on the New York Times website, on Facebook, trying to figure out what was going on and what I could do to help. And you know, I have 3 kids, and it was really, really difficult to focus and to write. I'm in the process of editing a manuscript that may or may not get published. It's an adult manuscript, so I don't know if anybody's going to want it. And because it's new, unlike, so if you're an established author, this is my understanding according to my agent, if you're an established author and, oh, okay, Ilene is coming back, hopefully. If you are an established author, oh, I see her coming, then you can sell something on proposal because they have a work product for you. But if you if you translate into a different genre, then you actually have to write the entire product. Welcome back, Ilene. Sorry.
Hello?
You're back. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear us? I can hear you, Ilene.
I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Oh no. Well, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I can hear you now. Sorry about that.
Good. No, I was rambling on about how it's been so difficult to write during this time. And it's true, having everybody in the house, it's like the pets, the children, the everybody's on the internet. So the internet gets strained. My husband is home. He's trying to work. It's really, there's so many distractions. I mean, honestly, my favorite place to write is in the library, where I'm surrounded by other very studious people. And obviously that's no longer an option. But do you want to jump in how writing during this difficult time has been for you? Oh, can you still hear us?
Okay, I can hear you now. I'm going to take I'm going to pick up my headphones because I'm not sure. Great. Sorry about that.
Let's touch a tiny bit on this sort of lockdown, social distancing period, how it's affected your writing, and also, you know, I think it would be worthwhile to mention a lot of the sort of the racism that's cropped up against Asians during all of this.
Yeah. The quarantine has been, I mean, it struck at a time where I was totally on the promotion horse anyway. So I wasn't probably going to be doing a lot of active writing other than, you know, writing essays and blog posts. So in some respects, that was kind of a blessing. I had a planned 1.5 week vacation, like in April as anyway. Yeah, but so far it has been good in that I have more time to spend with my family. I have more time to sleep and think a little bit more clearly. But it certainly has upped anxiety levels to the point where I'm not sure if I would have. I feel like I have resorted so much to escapism, to, you know, watching movies or even playing video games with my kids, you know, just as a way to while away the time and keep my mind off of the rising numbers and graphs. I was so obsessed with graphs for a long time. And so that was a really key thing about the timing of it. I think that you have to make more effort to reach out to people during this time. And so a lot of people are realizing how important people are in their lives, and I think that's a really good thing that I hope we will carry on. And the racism that a lot of people are experiencing within the Asian community, I feel like I have luckily been relatively insulated from. I don't know if it's because of my profession, because people, you know, obviously don't want to piss off their doctor, but also maybe sometimes I'll see strange looks when I go out with masks. I was obviously an early adopter of wearing masks out in public. It's been distressing, really distressing to see the things that some of my friends have posted. And I am sort of glad that my daughter isn't in school right now. She actually did have a small illness, like just a sore throat and fevers before lockdown, and people were spreading rumors that she had coronavirus. But I mean, I think that it's obviously a time where stories are more important than ever. And as doctors, I feel like we have relied on the stories that have been told coming out of Italy and New York to keep us motivated and strict in this lockdown, to keep us aware of the dangers that we can face so that we're not cavalier about putting on masks or, using the appropriate protective equipment. I mean, if it weren't for these stories, I think it would have been easy to fall back into the, like, oh, well, they probably don't have coronavirus, you know. But then when you read that, so in my area, they recently tested prisoners in the Montgomery prison system, and out of like 780 detainees, 18% or like 177 were positive, and only 6 of those 177 were symptomatic. The remaining 170 were asymptomatic. I mean, it's the silence and the mass confusion surrounding this coronavirus is just as deadly as the virus itself.
It is. It's a very interesting time that we're in. Okay, some last thoughts. I was going to ask you quickly about setting. We have about 5 minutes left, but I loved the setting of your book, and I understand that it was loosely based off of the town where you grew up. And so, what were the benefits or challenges of writing about a place that you know so intimately?
Yeah, I mean, the benefits were that, you know, they were specific names of places and restaurants that I could like see in my mind's eye and could try to draw. The downsides was that I did actually have to fit the place into the plot that I created. I actually fictionalized the university a bit. And so I got some comments saying, like, you know, it's Utica College, not Utica University. And I'm like, yes, I know, but you know, we fictionalized.
Purposeful, right?
You know, people are like fact checking, you know, my geography of Utica, because I haven't lived there in 25 years. So it's, you know, it's, and I had to actually like Google like where things were now. But that sense of claustrophobia, though, of living in a place where you don't necessarily fit in, that was something that I wanted to try to create. And obviously it was really, you know, I had fun. I did write in some sympathetic characters that were very similar to, you know, English teachers I had growing up.
Oh, that's so great.
Very fun.
And I liked how you had the characters are in the same town, but they go to different schools. So it allows for also some explanations of different experiences, even with living in the same location.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Jocelyn goes to public school and Will goes to private school. Like, again, the
same with my two. I mean, but New York City, everybody understands that New York City is huge, and there's lots of different types of New York City. Yeah. But that was another thing that I wanted to bring forward. Yeah. So I want to thank everybody so much for tuning in, and thank you so much, Ilene. I'm going to just quickly let's see if I can bring up these slides just to show you guys in case you want to follow Ilene on her, this is her website, and both on Twitter and Instagram at iwgregorio.com. And both of her books are fantastic. I highly recommend that you buy them and read them and tell all your friends about them. And Ilene, you want to jump in and say something about what you're doing with the to help support the indie bookstores?
Yeah. So anyone who buys a copy of my book from an independent bookseller, any independent bookseller, will get a signed book plate and a free dry erase sticker. They're so exciting. You can actually put "This is my brain in love with what" blank, and you can write it in and erase it.
That's so cute.
I love them. And on my website, the landing page, there's just details on a giveaway so that you can also be put in a contest to win a $100 gift certificate. And if you're a teacher or librarian, you can also win a class set and a Skype visit. And so that is closing in a couple of days, but you should go ahead if you do want to buy it. I love my independent stores. Have been so instrumental to connecting me with readers and to supporting me. And I'm, one of my biggest fears of this pandemic is that they're not going to be there anymore.
I know, we have to support them.
So supporting them is important. So on my website, on the landing page, there are links to 7 to 8 different booksellers that have specific links to my book. And so I would, if you want to do that, you can get fun swag and, potentially win more money and spread the love of any.
Yay. And on the offers, there's also a link directly to one of those bookstores if you want to just jump on it and grab it now. Yes. But so great. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of your attention and your comments. They're so great. And it's so nice to know that there's still people out there who are interested in connecting over books, even though we can't connect in person. So thank you so much again, Ilene, for joining us. And I can't wait to read your next book.
Yay.
So hurry up already.
I know. Oh, yeah.
All right. Bye, everybody. Stay safe. Wear your masks.
Yes.
Bye.
Shelter in Story.